310 law applies. So when I get calls about, do I need a 310 permit? I always tell folks, hey, it's a free permit. It's really easy to apply for. I'd rather have a letter from a board of elected officials saying, I don't need a 310 permit, and sorry for, wasting a little bit of your time, than have somebody come to me in 10 years and say, why didn't you get a 310 permit, and call me a violator. So, as you guys see projects, I hope you just keep this permit in mind. And as you work with planning staff, just to make sure they're all aware of it. And that's really it. Here's my contact information. You can reach me or any of the staff of the Missoula Conservation District at the Natural Resource Service Center over there on Mullen and Reserve. And actually pretty soon, a year or so here, we'll be moving to the Rocky Mountain Exploration Center over by the fairground with the Weed District and the Butterfly Garden. So cool things to come. I can answer a few questions if you have them, or just wanted to, I'll stop sharing my screen here.
Great, thanks a lot.
Yeah.
A great presentation, very informative. Are there any questions for Mr. Watkins? Sean, please start us off here.
For sure, I believe Dave beat me. All right.
Sure. Dave, the floor has been given to you if you want to go.
Yeah.
Sean, you're off mute. Dave's saying you can go.
All right. So real quick, I'm curious if there's any teeth to this law for violations. If you're a violator, what's to stop you?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. So we have a complaint process. In fact, if you guys know of any complaints, see complaints and want to turn them in, you're more than welcome. We follow up on our complaints. We try to get people to correct their actions. Usually that involves getting a 310 permit to replant or do whatever other undo, sometimes riprap, illegal riprap or something like that. They actually have to take it out and then do a proper bank stabilization permit or plan. So that would involve, getting a 310 permit. The maximum fine is $500, I think, for violation, but each and every day is a separate offense. So, it could be quite costly. The district's not really out there to be the environmental police, and that's not really what the Board of Supervisors is interested in. What they really like to do is help people be proactive and try to figure out how to enhance their habitat or accomplish their project with lower impacts. But yeah, there definitely is potential to have fines levied against people.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then I got two more questions here.
Yeah.
I saw that FWP is part of the application process, and I'm curious how much you guys work with them. And then my other question is who is the Board of Supervisors?
Good questions. So the whole way the 310 law is written is really FWP decides whether or not there will be site inspection. They almost always do. I mean, I have a case where someone's trying to mow some knapweed that's kind of in a lawn, and nobody really cares about that because they're going to then plant a bunch of plants. And so that one, they kind of let me go out without FWP. But usually I spend a day, like yesterday, I was out with Lad No-Tech all day, checking out 310 applications. Tomorrow, I'm going to go out with Leo Rosenthal, who works at the Swan. So we work pretty closely with our FWP partners and certainly take their advice into consideration. The board really listens to, their scientific opinion. And they provide a lot of technical advice too when we're out on site doing these site inspections. There's a team member report that's filled out by the supervisor that goes to visit the site and FWP. And so when we have our board meetings, we kind of go over those reports and see what they thought of the project as well. And for who are the supervisors? Well, Josh is one of them. And it's a pretty broad, I'm not sure if you want names or the kind of backgrounds they have.
I guess I'm just curious how many there are and make up, roughly. I don't need their names. We don't need to list.
Yeah. So we have 7 elected supervisors. I shouldn't say that. We have 5 elected supervisors and 2 are appointed, one by the county and one by the city. And then we have 2 associate supervisors. And that's Bart Morris from Oxbow and Josh, our associate supervisors. And they have a broad range of background. I mean, we have 3 ranchers or people who have done professional ranching for most of their lives. We have our chairman, Tim Hall, was a planner, has a planning background. We have a farmer who's an economist / farmer. We have an engineer from Trout Unlimited. So a pretty diverse background of people who have, I would say, way above average natural resource experience. And people have really been on the board for a long time. Like Josh's dad's on the board and has been on for, is it over 40 years now? Josh, did he just get that award for 40 years on the board? And he's not even the longest serving member. Tim Hall, who's just about my age, he's been chairman for 27 years, I think. So by the time they've been doing this so long, you really, even if they did have the skill set going in, but they certainly have developed a lot of skills. And they're engaged in a lot of other things in our community, usually serve on a lot of other boards. And but yeah, really, I think they're just great people who really understand natural resource management, but also understand private property rights and trying to have working land and all those sort of aspects. So real diverse group and make great decisions. You guys are welcome to Zoom in or come to when we finally have physical meetings. Come to one of our meetings anytime. We'd love to have you.
Great, thanks.
You bet. Thank you.
Dave, it's your turn.
So Sean, am I on? Okay. Sean asked all the important questions, but I want to ask a similar question. This guy had the same thing. I had an experience last summer with a company in a pumper truck suddenly showing up on O'Brien Creek and laying his pipe down there and pumping. And as I drove up into the area where I live, luckily I spied somebody who's not with the Resource Conservation District, but she knows who's who. And they called it in. This would be late summer because O'Brien Creek is severely impacted to begin with. And I never heard what happened from the illegal withdrawal, because I stopped and asked those guys, what are you doing? What's going on here? No, we just got a permit. I said, okay, show me. No, we're out of here. So I'm relaying that about how to Radley, like, is that an often thing? I mean, that was maybe just last summer. That's number one observation. Number two, this is old news. On Clark Fork River, somebody took all the riparian vegetation right down to the bones, and it never came back. And I don't know if the Resource Conservation District can retrofit, go back in later on, or is it, if you don't catch them, is it too late? I guess that's the question part.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think there's a statute of limitation, but I'm not familiar with that, to tell you the truth.
Okay.
You're not talking about the recent levee clearings.
No. This is old stuff, like 10 years ago in an outside bend of Clark Fork, actually right near where O'Brien Creek comes out.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. 10 years would be tough to go after someone, probably.
And it never got fixed, if you will. It was, questions were asked by lots of people, not me personally, about what to do. And the interesting thing is that And usually riparian vegetation comes up on its own, even though you cut it off. And
Yeah, right.
and it's not. So something's being done there to keep it clean as a whistle, right off the outside bank.
Yeah, well, one of the things that gets done a lot of times is when people start to mow their lawn, and you see this on lakes and other places, they feel like they're grandfathered in. But every time you're mowing a lawn next to a creek or stream, it's another clearing of vegetation. So that's a brand new offense if that's occurring. Regarding the pumping water out of the creek, that wouldn't be a 310 violation. It's not vegetation removal. It's not manipulating the banks. It's not changing the channel. So yeah, that might be I'm not even sure if that's a water quality district or who. I would have to look into that. But yeah, we don't have much authority. I mean, really what we try to do is proactive work with landowners. But the reason I came to you guys was just, I haven't been here very long in this position. I've been out with builders who said they've been building for 25 years and they never knew there was a 310 permit needed. And I don't think they're pulling the wool over my eyes. They're like, I'm going to go tell all my building friends,
You're not
like,
paying attention. Come on.
yeah, I mean, but it's kind of a permit that flies under the radar, and it's really important. And as we've all seen, the growth of Missoula County is just skyrocketing. I'm kind of like a caveman who's been thawed out of the ice. I'm coming back to Missoula after being gone for 25 years. So, I think everything's still 1993. And it's an interesting perspective to see how things have grown and what things have gotten better and what things have gotten worse. I mean, way more hiking opportunities and public land access right in town. Grizzly bears coming back in the Bitterroot, bull trout plummeting. Clark Fork cleaned up, but much more pressure on it. I mean, these things are all interesting, and it's like a snapshot to me because I was gone. But it also makes me think about what's the next 25 years going to be, and that's a blink of an eye. And you're talking about cumulative effects, or the death of natural resources by 1,000 cuts. So just really need all people who care and who have a say in land use practices to remember that this is one of the tools we have for at least protecting sort of the veins of our community, the waterways that are so important economically and culturally and ecologically.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Micah, you're next.
Yeah, thank you, Radley, for the presentation and the information. It's been really helpful. I'm just curious if there's been a trend in one way or the other of like an increase in the number of permits that you're seeing at those monthly meetings. And if you feel like you're nearing capacity, or like there's capacity to spare with the amount of development that's happening, the number of permits that are coming through the conservation district.
Yeah, I think in general that there's sort of a seasonal trend. Obviously, this time of year, things pick up. I haven't been here long enough to say. My understanding is the trend has been increasing in amount of permits filed, but I don't really know that, and I should graph that out sometime, but I haven't done that yet. We're not at capacity for what we can permit or process. It's just, can we do some of that other cool stuff that we do? We have to do the 310 law. Missoula County is pretty lucky because we are funded, our department's funded, we're our own district, like a school board, and we get a little bit of the tax mill. So, we're better funded than like Granite County, who has one half-time employee and the board does most of the work, really relies on fish, wildlife, and parks. So the capacity is not really so much what we can process, but just, what the land can tolerate. And really most of these permits, I mean, like recently we had somebody who said they wanted to clear a 40 by 60 swath of land next to the creek so they could fish and play. Well, that's just it's kind of a no-go. you go out there on a site inspection and say, well, you might be able to prune a couple dead branches and get a line in there, but that's just not something that's allowed. So it's not like you need that to access your land. You're not building a bridge, but then you get these big water diversion point head gates going in that are pretty serious projects, but the board's not going to take away anyone's right to use water if they have a water right. So I don't know if that kind of speaks to what you're getting at, but or if you have anything clarifying there.
Yeah, no, I that was helpful. We just, I think heard from other departments and other folks that perhaps capacity of just like staff time is a limiting factor with the number of, development permits and things that are coming through. So yeah, no, that was helpful information. Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. I have a question for you or you guys. When you're dealing with the planning staff, is there planning staff involved that has an ecological background, like people who are trained in ecology? Would it be helpful for us to do a training for planning staff? I guess we would like to help if planners are maxed out on processing building permits or subdivision permits and need extra help to pay attention to some of these little details that they might not be trained in. That is something I think the district would be really into supporting. So I don't know if, do they have planners on staff who are trained in riparian ecology or hydrology or?
Yeah, I think, but Dave, do you want to take a crack at the answer, or do you raise your hand for another question? You're muted. You're muted, Dave.
Sorry about that.
That's
So
okay.
historically, to Radley, I used to work down there, but that's a long time ago, 10 years ago. And there were always a few people who understood it. Everybody understood the process of 310. And I know for sure that our people working for the county who understand these concepts, maybe a quick briefing to them. Remember, the about 310. There are people with some expertise already and it'd be nice to make sure that connection is really firm. So I would advocate offering that on a quick version of it. And can I add one more thing? I must apologize. Previously, I mentioned the Clark Fork. It wasn't there. It was the Bitterroot at O'Brien Creek.
No worries.
So,
yeah.
Sorry about that.
Nope. There's a lot of rivers around here. Thanks.
Are there
Well,
any more questions for Radley? Okay, thanks again, Radley. That was really informative. It's really helpful for us to hear about the great work that you and others are doing at the Conservation District. And I'll make sure to relay your offer to city and county staff, many of which who are not here today, who typically work with us. And I think Dave's right on that they probably are pretty familiar with this sort of stuff.
Great.
But yeah, always great to learn more and work together more efficiently. So thanks.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for the help with getting the word out. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Radley.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Josh. Bye,
Josh,
guys.
thanks for setting this up. That was really informative. I know we've heard the word 310 a number of times, and at least in the last few months, and it was really helpful for me to get the full picture of what that means. So thanks.
You bet. Yeah, I think just having more people informed that it exists, I think that if all the 310 permits were being issued that should be issued or requested that should be requested, that, they'd have a lot more work. I think people just don't know about it. I think realtors, for example, would be a good body that could be informed on 310 law, because, I think, we see some cases where somebody buys a piece of land and, the realtor told me I could do basically whatever I wanted, and they've cut down all the vegetation right to the edge of the bank. And most people really want to work and do the right thing. they just don't know what the right thing is, I think, and they're more than happy to, you know, take the steps necessary to improve fish habitat and you know, protect the riparian corridor. And, you know, the board, I think, is really works with people as well. They're not trying to be punitive. They want to inform people and work with people and protect property rights and find a middle ground most of the time. It's the repeat offenders that just don't care and you know, do whatever they want that are, you know, sometimes a problem. Most people just are unaware that they're doing anything wrong.
Yeah, well said.
Agreed. Thank you, Josh.
Thanks
Great.
again.
Have a nice night, Radley.
Okay, bye guys, thanks.
So we'll move on to the next special presentation for the evening. We have Aaron Wilson from the MPO, who has just popped on video, and he's going to give us an update on the draft long-range transportation plan, which we've seen a few times here before and is in draft form at this point. Thank you for joining us, Aaron.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, Vince is right. I feel like we've been here quite a few times. I think more so than we have in the past on long range plan updates. But it's been great. I feel like planning board has been really engaged, maybe more so than in the past in transportation, and that's been really helpful for us. So at this point, I'm back largely with an overview update of what's an overview of how we've laid out the draft long range transportation plan. I think it's important for this board to see the plan before it gets approved and adopted. Just as a reminder, planning board is sort of designated as the MPO in Missoula. That sort of decision-making authority is then delegated to TTAC and TPCC. But there is a role for planning board to play, and I think it's a good supplement to the other kinds of planning work that you see. So I'm gonna share my screen here if I can. So as I mentioned, so we've been doing a lot of work over the last year and a half. We've been to planning board several times. A lot of what I'm going to go over is not necessarily new information. It's just the culmination of all of the work that we've done, and an overview of how we've laid this out in the draft plan, which hopefully you all have had a chance to at least glance through. We had a sort of late attachment to the agenda, just trying to get the plan drafted and out to the public late last week. But there's still plenty of time to comment on it. And my hope was to go get some initial feedback and let planning board know sort of where we're at, have an initial conversation if we can on the draft plan during this public comment period. And then we're going to be going into adoption with the MPO in June. And so I thought it was important that you all had an opportunity to see this and provide comment before it's adopted officially by TPCC, because then we're going to come back to you after that as part of a growth policy, or, you know, adoption of the long range plan as an issue plan or amendment to the growth policy, which is sort of standard practice or how we've addressed transportation in the growth policies in the past. So just a little bit of I guess process and wanting to make sure that you all had an opportunity to comment and review this before we bring a finalized adopted plan back to you as part of the growth policy. So if there are no questions about that, I'll just dive in. Feel free to stop me at any point as we go through. I'm just going to kind of go through this fairly quickly and then have an opportunity for conversations about where we're at with the plan and what you might want to see that we have not included. So the plan, as we've drafted it, my goal is always to have plans that are reasonably short and not so long that no one wants to pick them up and look at them. And I think we've hit a good middle ground on this. We have 10 chapters. I think there's about 140 pages in the plan itself. And then we have another 100 or 200 pages of appendices that are more for the people who are really interested in the topics and really want to dive deep on some of the aspects in here. Shouldn't be news to all of you because we've talked about this a lot. The plan is built on a foundation of our 5 goals. that stem from all of the work that we did early on in terms of identifying community values. And then from there, we walk into a review of our evaluation framework and the process we use to collect projects, score, rank, develop this 3 scenarios, looking at some of the analysis metrics for each of those. And then moving into, as sort of in the later chapters of the plan, after setting that foundation, we have our recommendations, including our 71 recommended capital projects. We have an additional 27 programs and policies that are sort of those pieces that are in addition to the infrastructure that are going to be necessary to achieve the goals in our plan, or at least will be important as we move forward with transportation. So not just focusing on what we're going to build, but also what we're going to do and how we're going to manage our transportation system to get the most out of those investments. And then the plan kind of wraps up with talking about how we're going to measure performance over time. I think it's really important for plans to be driven not only by data, but by continuing evaluation and making sure that we're tracking our success over time. And so talk a little bit about that. And then finally, we have some near-term actions. So not only setting priorities in terms of projects and funding and programs, but what do we think we can and should start to tackle first in the next 2 to 5 years of the plan. Thinking about, again, implementation being a really key aspect, that we don't just want a plan that lays out a good vision. We want to have a good strategy for how we tackle that. So that's kind of overview. I'm going to walk through sort of not exactly chapter by chapter, but sort of start from the beginning of the plan and what's there, and then wrap up with the sort of end of the plan and those near-term actions. So this plan starts with an overview of what we're charged with as an MPO. So setting the stage for why we do the long-range transportation plan. It's an important part of what we do at the MPO, including outlining the federal planning process that we do have federal requirements for a long-range transportation plan. It's one of the reasons we do this every 4 years. So it's a fairly loose set of guidelines, but really is driven by data and community input and vision, and using all of that to have a really strategic way to go from what are our goals and objectives and what we want to get out of transportation through the analysis, having public involvement through all of that, and then coming up with our programming, including our investments, and looking at some of our performance evaluation and how we're going to measure success. And as a reminder, this chapter talks a little bit about who and what the MPO is, because I think there isn't necessarily very good understanding in the community, the broader community, about the MPO and our role and what we do. And so reinforcing that this is a regional transportation plan. Our planning area, which is this orange line on the map, goes well beyond city limits and encompasses some of our satellite communities like Lolo and communities out by the Y and Bonner and Tura. And so that is sort of the scale of what we're looking at in this plan. And then we wanted to go through and talk about, before we get into our recommendations and analysis of transportation, to really set the stage for building on all of the work that we have done to date. So that includes looking at other planning processes that have happened over the last 4 years or previously, including growth policies, things like the affordable housing policy, our climate action plans, Mountain Lions strategic plan, all of these things that can really inform what we do in transportation, and sort of laying that groundwork. And then looking at some trends, looking at growth and affordability and how that relates to things like transit and equity, and looking at existing travel, looking at our mode split, how many people are biking or walking, and where those different modes are occurring, what the differences are, and really using all of that to develop what our opportunities are for the region, and what our outcomes might be, and keeping that in mind as we shape our recommendations and think about where we're going with our transportation system. So again, trying to have a data-driven approach that looks at all of the other work that we do, doesn't start from scratch, and tries to build on what we're trying to accomplish in our community. And then equally important to that background in the data is really working with the community and getting good input on what our values and vision are not just for our community, but for our transportation system. And so that's an equally important component of what those opportunities might be for the region. So how do we take what we have today and make strategic investments and move ourselves along? So we had a little bit of a disruptive year, to say the least, in terms of our input and engagement. But I think we started really strong with our initial workshop last March, so a little over a year ago, and we had, I think, close to 200 people show up and go through a history of transportation and talk about values and vision. I think it was one of the more, if not the most successful transportation public meeting I think we've held in a really long time. I think 2 weeks later, everything shut down because of COVID, and we quickly shifted into virtual like everyone else has been over the last year. And I think still continue to get good engagement, if not just a little bit different. People, we reached some different people, some new folks who maybe don't engage because they were able to do so virtually. We had really good participation through our website and social media. We did surveys, mapping activities. We did some virtual open houses, small group meetings, and we even did some printed materials. So we reached out through the food bank and aging services and some of our other partners to try to reach folks who may not be online as much or as connected with all of the planning work that's going on. So I think we reached, a couple, at least several thousand people through one of those mediums. And so had really good public engagement. And that is another core foundation for the recommendations that are in this plan. So all of that leads us into development of the goals. And we've been talking about these a lot, so I won't spend a lot of time on them. Hopefully you are all familiar, but just reiterating that these 5 goals are the foundation of our plan. And so there's a lot of work that happened to develop these. And then we use them sort of at every stage throughout the rest of the process in terms of our evaluation and developing and evaluating recommendations and in terms of what we want to measure for plan performance in the future. And so all of those things relate back to these 5 goals ultimately. And I think in terms of this plan, I hope we've done a really good job. And one of the things I like about this is that we've really simplified these goals. We've gone from 8 or 10 goals with a number of different objectives down to these sort of 5 core goals that I think hopefully reflect the values and the vision from the rest of our community and are easy to illustrate and easy to communicate. So hopefully that is a key part of our plan, is that our goals and what we're trying to get out of our transportation system is more clear. So then the next half of the plan, sort of from goals on, is really about how we developed the recommendations and what those recommendations are. And so again, don't really need to talk about the framework we use. We've presented this a number of times, but just to reiterate that we have tried to be systematic throughout this process, starting with collecting sort of the full range of potential improvements and projects and ideas that came from the community, from our agency partners, from city and county staff, and put all those together, and then went through this process to screen for projects that are appropriate for a long range plan, looking at scoring them based on metrics associated with those 5 goals. And then from there, putting them into different scenarios that evaluated some trade-offs and helped illustrate what our limitations are, but what we can do within those financial limitations. And then finally, prioritizing our recommended projects and putting those into a plan for how and when we will fund them over the next 30 years. So trying to be deliberate and transparent in how we got from here are all the potential projects we could do to these are the 71 projects we're recommending in this plan in terms of funding. So part of that evaluation, we're looking at the 3 transportation scenarios that we developed to help weigh some of the trade-offs. And so we do some work explaining this in the plan and laying this out in terms of weighing those trade-offs and having 3 scenarios that are all intended to be multimodal. So they all are intended to meet our goals, but in slightly different ways. And hopefully the names of these scenarios are reflective of what's in them. But we had new connections. That was a scenario really focused on building new roads and some of these larger, more expensive projects that create new connections throughout the region, whether that's roadway connections or new bridges or major new trail corridor connections. And then we had another scenario, enhanced connections, that was really focused on taking what we have and building that out. So things like our neighborhood greenways or complete street retrofits for our existing roadways. And again, trying to maximize that investment of existing infrastructure. And then regional equity was a scenario focused on trying to maximize investment in ways that will enhance our equity in the region, whether it's investments in Invest Health neighborhoods or areas that have populations of people with a disability or low income or some of these other measures of equity, and really trying to be intentional about projects that will improve those areas. So 3 scenarios. We also had the 2 growth scenarios, if you'll remember, where we evaluated what impact different growth patterns might have on our transportation system. So all of that work led to, I believe the last time we were here, we presented on our draft recommendations. We got a lot of feedback on that and have refined it, but really our goal is to have a truly multimodal transportation plan and making investments across a number of different projects that help prioritize our community needs. And so those include complete streets projects. So those improvements to existing roadways that provides enhancements to all modes, things like transit, biking, walking, vehicular access, really just taking existing streets and making them function for all modes. And then we have some active transportation projects, both on streets, so things like our neighborhood greenways and sidewalks and bike lanes, but also our shared use path and commuter trail network, which is really critical to our transportation system. Things like extending the Milwaukee Trail or enhancements to the Bitterroot Trail. We also have safety improvements. So these are our projects that are really focused on areas that have high crash rates or trends that we can address, and trying to make sure that we have a multimodal system that is safe for all users, really focused on protecting the most vulnerable users first, and then enhancing safety for all other modes. And then we have roadway extension projects. So these are those new connections. We did pull some projects from the new connection scenario that we identified as really key connections. So these are areas of high growth, providing new roadways, areas like the North Reserve, Urban Renewal District, where we're seeing a lot of potential growth, and we need to find ways to connect that growth to other parts of Missoula. And then finally, we have our bridge or crossing improvements. So these are facilities that are getting people across our rivers and railroad tracks. So thinking about increasing the permeability of, say, getting across the river and increasing that accessibility and connectivity. So within each of those different kinds of projects, we put them into both different categories. So you'll see there's a range of projects in each one of those transportation categories. But we also programmed those improvements over the next 30 years into 3 different timeframes. So we have near-term projects, which are the next 1 to 5 years. A lot of those are projects that are already programmed in our capital improvement program or our transportation improvement program. But there was some available discretionary funding for those highest priority projects that we want to get done in that really near term. Then the medium term is 6 to 15 years out. So sort of the next tier of priority projects that we think we can get to. And then long term are really those projects that are either really high cost that we won't have enough funding in the near or medium term to get done, or have real challenges where we need to figure out things like right away or other issues where there's some feasibility analysis that needs to happen, or they're just slightly lower priority. So all of these projects, 71 recommended projects, are broken out into one of those 3 time periods. So within the recommended projects, there are 22 near-term projects. A lot of these are already committed. So you'll see some familiar ones like the Build Grant. That project is going to construction hopefully later this year. But that is one that we expect to see, and there are some other improvements that we're hoping to find funding for or program to complete that project and fill that funding gap. We also have Russell Street. That project has funding already committed to it. We hope to have that going into construction in 2024 or 2025. So that's been a regional priority for probably close to 30 years now, and so it's exciting to see it finally coming to completion. And then there are some other priorities like the front end main two-way conversion in downtown. That's been a priority in the downtown master plan. We have a number of neighborhood greenways that we think we can get to in the near term. So those fairly cheap and easy to implement, low stress, low volume neighborhood streets that really make the neighborhood to neighborhood connections, and we can do that in a really cost effective way. So providing some non-motorized connectivity in the core of Missoula. Another aspect, so as we go into this part of the plan, one of the designs in the layout of the plan that I'm kind of excited about are these project spotlights. So we've tried to highlight some key opportunities or areas in the projects and provide a little bit more detail. So this is an example of the Reserve Street area and our projects that we're recommending, and talking a little bit about the growth pressures that we're seeing in the Swatup-Kane area, the North Reserve, the North Scott Street, all of these areas that we're seeing a lot of pressure in this part of town, and trying to really focus on what we're proposing in this plan and how it relates to these areas. So just an opportunity to spend a little bit more time focused on an area like this or specific types of projects. And so you'll see a number of these spotlights throughout the plan for projects that either illustrate a particular kind of project or an area that we really need to focus on, or a topic that we think warrants some additional highlighting. And hopefully it improves for folks who may want to just be flipping through these plans, who don't want or don't have the ability to read. I think that, we're all constrained for time, and these spotlights will really help draw people's attention to some key issues. So then, in addition, as I mentioned, we have our recommended projects, but the programs and policies is something that we focused a lot on in this plan that we haven't necessarily in past plans, that these are non-infrastructure recommendations, but they are just as important to our mode split goals and achieving our vision as some of the infrastructure investments. Some of these are new programs and policies that we haven't implemented yet in Missoula. Some of them are building on programs that we are already doing. So you'll see things like safe routes to school, which we are doing in Missoula. We have safe routes identified. This sign in this photo is just around the corner from my house. But there are opportunities to expand that program and continue to implement it and make sure that we have opportunities to engage around safe routes to schools. So that's one example. There's some new programs, things like safe routes to transit. So taking that same idea that we have in safe routes to school, applying it to how are people getting to transit? Are there accessible, safe ways for people to get to transit stops and access those services? And then, we have a number of new programs that are going to require partnership and some resources. And so we want to think about how we might fund those and who might be our key partners, and trying to start identifying that so we can work on implementation. And then again, having some spotlights on those programs and policies. So the ones that we think are really key aspects of this plan and that we want to really call attention to, we have these spotlights to give a little bit more detail and provide an opportunity to highlight things like encouraging compact growth that we saw was really effective in helping us achieve our transportation goals, and some of the recommendations that we might want to think about. And so this may be an area where you all, as part of planning board, thinking about some of these recommendations and how they relate to transportation. So finally, thinking about funding the plan, it's not just the recommendations and the programs, but thinking about what revenue we have available. There, as we've mentioned in previous meetings, there's about $1.3 billion in anticipated transportation revenue over the next 30 years. About 50% of that is anticipated to be local revenue, and keeping in mind that full 1.3 billion includes our federal and local funds. It includes maintenance funding, transit, our capital improvements. So there's a whole host of types of costs and revenues that we have included and described in some detail in the plan. Just a reminder, the discretionary funding for those recommended projects and programs is a really small portion of that. It's about $208 million out of that 1.3 billion. So after you take out transit and maintenance and some of those funding sources that we don't have any control over, we were left with that 200 million, which is what we're largely talking about in this plan. The other aspect to funding that we talk about a little bit is just the increasing uncertainty as we move into the future. So, beyond 5 or 10 years, it's really hard to know what's going to happen with federal funding, even locally. Just recently, Missoula's local option fuel tax was, or statewide, it was repealed by the legislature. So something that Missoula had passed by, the voters had passed just last year was repealed. So there's a funding source that even within a year, there's high uncertainty for. And we know that gas tax as a revenue is declining throughout the nation and is going to continue to be a declining revenue source. And so we're going to have to be creative and strategic with how we fill those gaps. Which brings us to some discussion about potential revenue sources. We have a combination of revenue that's allowed by existing legislation. So things like impact fees or property taxes or special improvement districts are all funding sources that we utilize to some degree and are there and available for helping to fill our transportation need. Most of these we're already using. Many of them can be expanded for either specific projects or to address identified needs. Other sources that we talk about are not currently authorized, but we think it's worth starting to think about as a community and a region as changes are happening at the federal and state level. It's important for us to be ready for those changes and at least be thinking about it and either advocating for new revenue sources as we lose some existing like gas tax. And we really need to be creative in thinking about partnerships, whether that's a public-private partnership or working with federal government revenue sources or whatever funding we can find to help meet the needs as our region grows. So then measuring success, this is sort of, as we move forward after this plan, thinking about what data we're measuring and how we're identifying whether we're being successful in implementing this plan or if this plan is actually achieving the goals and the vision that our community holds. So we maintained our ambitious mode share targets from the 2016 plan. So that includes reducing our drive alone commute rate by 50%, so down to 34% by 2045, which is a really ambitious target. But what that achieves is significantly reducing our drive alone trips in that future year of 2045 or 2050. And so it allows us to utilize our existing infrastructure more efficiently. So we also established a number of different performance metrics tied to our goals. So those could be things like improving access to schools and jobs, or some of our climate goals and measuring greenhouse gas emissions related to transportation, and trying to report on those annually. So this plan recommends producing that performance measure report every year, so that we can be tracking our success and having those conversations about what we're trying to achieve in transportation. Are we being successful? And then when we come around to do this update in 4 or 5 years, we will have been having those conversations all along, and hopefully can make some additional progress on any plan update. It also ensures that we're consistent with state targets, federal requirements. So in recent federal surface transportation bills, there was a requirement to do performance measures. And so we have those integrated into our transportation plan as well. And then we wrap up the plan by what we call taking the first steps. And so a lot of this, a lot of things that we're talking about in this plan are already underway, some of the committed projects or some of the programs. But there's a lot of new things in here, and we wanted to prioritize sort of which steps we should be taking first. So thinking about which which actions are going to help us achieve those goals, and what are the highest priority projects to implement, and thinking about those projects and programs for all modes, and thinking about regional, not just in the core of the city, but how are we connecting to some of these satellite communities like Lolo and Bonner, and how are we connecting people to the goods and services that they need. And just thinking that about partnerships are really critical. So I think as the more planning we do in the region, the more we see that there is all of our issues are interrelated. And so we need partnerships around housing affordability and how transportation is a component of that. And we need to be working with Mountain Line and making sure that we're achieving transit goals, and really fostering those partnerships so that we can be more successful in the long term. And then finally, our next steps for this process. So that's kind of the overview of the plan. We're at the final stages here. We're in the public draft review. We will have a 3-week public comment period. So through May 21st is our public comment. And then we will be taking any feedback we received, making final edits to the plan, and bringing it to our transportation committees for adoption in June. And so quickly wrapping up this project, but we're sort of in that last phase of refinement and hoping that we've captured all of the feedback accurately, and all of the work that we've done is adequately represented in the draft plan. So that's my quick overview. Happy to, let me stop sharing here. Happy to answer any questions, or if folks have had a chance to read through it. I know a lot of this is probably repeat, you've heard a lot of this before, but trying to just give a sense of how we put this plan together and what's in it.
Great, thank you, Aaron. Okay, questions?
I suppose if there are no questions, maybe that means we have had all the conversations we can have about transportation. But I know
I'll ask a general question for you. We've talked before in some prior presentations, had discussions about ways that we could improve or do more to integrate the transportation planning with long range planning that we do and that we see. So growth policy and the comprehensive plan. Do you guys have any idea? Is there anything like that included in the plan, for ways that we might, as the planning board, more specifically use this plan in sort of evaluating subdivisions and rezones? Is there, maybe there's not really a place for that, but that's my question.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, that's a really tough one. I think we've struggled with that a lot. I think one way we can use it is some of our recommendations, particularly around compact growth. So I think when you're thinking about different types of developments, that where that is located, and having that higher density or mix of uses is really critical for making sure we have a more efficient transportation system. And so I think we have some recommendations around just trying to foster that kind of development pattern, that if we want to keep our transportation costs down and be more efficient, then having a good mix of uses, having things like transit oriented development, and thinking about how we can foster that around existing or planned transit facilities, I think is important. And then I think there are some specific program and policy recommendations that could make review of those easier. So one of the recommendations we have, and I think maybe we talked about this the last time Jennifer was with us, but doing something like a road design standards and functional classification analysis that really looks at our transportation network and identifies both types of streets, so transit streets versus bike priority or freight priority, and then developing standards that go along with that. So when developments come in, there's really we have really good standards, and it's really transparent sort of what is expected of a development along a particular kind of street. It's sort of building on what we've done with the Swatupcane area master plan that has sort of a road atlas and clear design standards associated with that, and try to bring some more predictability both to our review for city staff who are reviewing subdivisions, but also just sort of getting ahead of that and not having to wonder sort of what types of transportation facilities do we need in this area. We would have that kind of laid out ahead of time. So I think if we can get that kind of work done, it will really help with development review and make that a more streamlined and predictable process.
Great, thanks for that, Aaron. I think that's spot on. Yeah, we've seen in some of the more complicated subdivisions, those specific regulations and the need to update them become apparent. And so, yeah, it sounds, and like, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like this plan could be a really helpful input to some future planning processes that update subdivision regulations or growth policies, zoning maps, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think so. There are other we have recommendations for doing a more integrated transportation demand management policy or regulations at the city. And so really pulling things like parking and transportation impact analysis and transportation improvements into one set of regulations, and think more creatively about, how we're evaluating that, and sort of simultaneously loosening some regulations like our parking requirements, but having some additional places where, like, if you're in the right location or you're doing a transit oriented development and you have good facility, like, do you need all of the parking that the current zoning might allow? So adding that flexibility along with good planning for multimodal transportation, which I think could be helpful.
Fantastic. Tim, like,
yeah, actually, kind of building on that, I have a couple of really somewhat tactical questions if you wanted to comment on that. So as it relates to sort of our role in the planning board, I saw on the plan that there was an idea of, around bike sharing in the downtown, and I'm curious if car sharing is part of the picture. I know that the general idea is to try to reduce car travel, but has car sharing been explored as a thing? And kind of related to that is, I think one of the draws of a place like Missoula is recreation, and I feel like that's kind of a challenge. Is if you rely on public transportation for getting around kind of day to day, what about recreation? And I think that's kind of, again, it's related to car sharing and how people get around. As an example, I think it's great that people can take the mountain lion to go float the river, right? But that to my knowledge is really the only public transportation accessible kind of recreation. So I don't know if you wanted to comment on either of those issues.
Yeah, no, it's a good point, and one that I think is, I guess the way I think about that is, when we talk about our mode split goals, we're typically talking about commutes, not necessarily sort of all trips, although, the more sustainable we can make every trip, the better. But where we see the most pressure on our transportation system is at the peak travel times, which is when people are getting to and from work. And it's not those recreation trips necessarily that are causing that congestion. And so what we focus on is, how are people getting to and from work? Do you have good access on transit to get from your home to your place of business, or is it easily walkable in your neighborhood so you can walk to work or bike or whatever? And fully recognizing that people will still have vehicles and want to recreate, and that is part of living in Montana and Missoula. But if we can achieve some of those reductions, maybe households can go from 2 cars to 1, because you have your 1 car for recreation, and maybe one person in the house has to drive to work, but the other can bike, walk, or bus. That has a substantial reduction in our need to expand transportation facilities. When you have to widen roads for that, you decrease connectivity, you make it less safe for adjacent neighborhoods, sort of all these cascading effects. And so the more efficiently we can use that during those peak times, it's sort of like, think about parking at the mall. It's really designed for Black Friday, which is 1 day a year. And then the rest of the year, basically an empty parking, it's not an empty parking lot, but maybe they're using 50% or less of the capacity. And if you look at our roads, it's largely the same, that you see full capacity at that 5 o'clock peak hour. All the rest of the, most of the rest of the day, with the exception of a couple of corridors, is largely free flowing, easy, very little traffic. So really targeted to that specific time frame. And then related to car share, I think this relates to that, is it's been shown over and over again that if you have good car share programs, people who utilize that drive less, because you have it when you need it, but it's sort of a safeguard. People are thinking more holistically about their trips. And so maybe you use a vehicle for longer trips, or if you have to go to Costco or Reserve, you take your car share out there, but you live close enough to work and other services that most of your trips you're doing other things. And so it just adds a level of flexibility for some of these other things that I think, certainly it's part of the plan, and would be really excited to see that happen in Missoula. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for it.
Good questions. Next is Josh.
Yeah, I guess it's not a question so much as an observation. Just found an interesting data point that 16% of the total Missoula County workforce is either going to or coming from Ravalli County. Do you have any comments on, is that more or less, from a safety standpoint, more or less dangerous than like Mineral County, where you have almost, the entire flow is going the same direction at the same time? We've talked a little bit about 93, and I don't know, just can relate it to some of the safety observations that we've had about 93.
Yeah, I mean, so I definitely on the same page. When you get those volumes of traffic, you tend to have more crashes. And those crashes tend to be more disruptive. So, if you have a crash on Highway 93 during peak travel time in whichever direction you're going, that's going to be really, there's not any redundancy. You don't have a different way to go. And so you're just stuck waiting. So I don't know that we've addressed that specifically in this plan. It's it's a really tough one to deal with, but I think a lot of our recommendations could help that, whether it's promoting, telecommute. So not for everybody, but if you live in the Bitterroot and you could telecommute 2 to 3 days a week, that's a substantial reduction in potential trips. I think looking at micro transit for maybe some of those outlying areas, or ways to better connect to the transit system in Missoula, so that you can get from the Bitterroot into Missoula. And then if you do, say you carpool or take some other form of shared mobility into Missoula, having good transit and connectivity, so when you need to get around, you don't need your vehicle in town. So I think all of those things are connected in to some degree. I don't know that it solves the problem in the near term, but we do have a couple of projects that MDT is looking at for safety and corridor studies along Highway 93, I think between Lolo and Florence. And so we have those in there in the plan as MDT priorities, and I think they will be moving those forward over the next 1 to 2 years.
Can you comment at all, Aaron, on what those look like? We got a pretty general email from, a public relations email from MDT, and they made reference to projects, but didn't provide, any details on what they might be.
Yeah, I don't right now. But I think as we get those projects coming forward, we can certainly relay those and try to keep you all up to date on that.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Aaron. And so next time we'll see you will be after the plan has been adopted, and you'll be coming back to us to get the approval to add it to the city's growth policy. Is that right?
Yeah, probably city and county. And I can't remember the exact I know for city issue plans, those typically come through planning board for recommendation. And I guess I would just reiterate too that we have this open for public comment, both individually for planning board members, or, if you had, as you come back together in 2 weeks and wanted to make specific recommendations as a board, we would certainly have time to integrate those and pass those along as we bring the plan forward. And we've tried to make it really easy to comment. So on the website, there's an interactive, we've got this tool where we're testing out. So I'd be curious to know sort of afterwards how, if you've all used it, that allows you to comment directly onto the draft plan through the website. And we've got some sort of basic information and ways to interact with the draft plan that hopefully is a little bit easier than just sending a PDF out and having people email us with comments. So you can add different types of comments to the plan. You can respond to other people's. There's a little bit of interactivity there that I think we don't always see when we get to a draft plan. So we'll be curious to see what folks think of that, or if you have thoughts on how well that's working and if it's a tool worth exploring for future plans.
Great, thank you. Well, I hope some of us here do take the time and to look through and make some comments personally. Yeah, and good luck to you, Aaron.
Yeah, thanks.
Always seems like a good process, and I look forward to seeing the final product.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Okay, so we'll move on to our next item tonight. Shane, am I correct? There was not a TPCC meeting between?
That's correct.
Okay, so we have no committee reports tonight. We have one more item on the agenda remaining, and this is the election of a vice president for the remainder of this year. It was tabled from the last meeting. I know a lot of us have busy schedules and hesitate to add one more thing. We do need to have a vice president. I will be able to attend the next upcoming meetings, but there will definitely be a time in the future that I won't be able to attend, and we need someone to run the meetings here. So are there any volunteers tonight, having had some more time to think about this? Okay, no one's jumping at the gun. We don't quite have everyone here tonight. Yeah, I won't. Obviously, we can't force anyone to volunteer. I think, if need be, we can continue to have this on as essentially a standing item on the agenda until somebody volunteers. I did speak with Josh in the week before that, but if no one volunteers here tonight, I'll have some more individual conversations with folks that I haven't talked with that might be interested. Hopefully, I'm keeping count of folks who have said they really can't do it. I don't want to, pester anyone who can't do it. So with that, I'll give one more chance for someone to nominate, and if not, we'll move on and table to the next meeting. Okay. Seeing none, we will move on. So the next item on the agenda should be, right, we have no new business. So comments from planning board members. Would anyone like to speak tonight on anything at all? Okay, very good. We will adjourn the meeting then here at 7:34. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next time.